Hello, everyone, and welcome to Slash Film Daily for Friday, June 7th, 2019. On today's episode, we're going to talk about the latest film and TV news, and in the mailbag, we'll talk about elevated horror films. This is Slash Film Editor-in-Chief Peter Sciretta, and joining me on today's podcast is Slash Film Weekend Editor Brad Oman.
Hey, that's me.
Senior writer Ben Pearson.
Hey, what's going on?
And writer Chris Evangelista.
Hello, folks.
So, Brad is actually in my house today. He is visiting Los Angeles. Brad, why are you here?
I just wanted to come here and just look at all your cool stuff and play with your dogs. That's pretty much it.
So there's no other purpose of you being in Los Angeles?
I mean, I guess I'm here to go to some Ghostbusters Fan Fest thing that's happening this weekend. It's the first one ever. It's happening on the Sony Pictures lot, where the Ghost Corps offices are, and apparently there's going to be some cool stuff, hopefully some cool news, and a bunch of things. Honestly, I have no idea what to really expect because it's the first time they've done this, so I don't know how it's situated or how what's going to be like when they have there's a panel that's supposed to have Ivan Reitman and Jason Reitman and Paul Feig and Dan Aykroyd talking about all the Ghostbusters movies. So who knows? It could be something awesome. It could be something average. We'll find out.
So we could.
I sure hope there are no girls at this festival, because girls are not allowed in the world of Ghostbusters.
I actually drove by the Sony Pictures a lot. Then there was like a hand painted sign from Little Rascals that said "He-Man Wolf Club." So I think it'll be fine.
Chris, Paul Feig is here, so I mean...
Yeah, but he's a guy. He's allowed in. He's a man. If he were a lady, they would stop him at the door and say, "I'm sorry, Ghostbusters is for men and boys, not ladies."
I would laugh so hard if the cast of Ghostbusters Answer the Call showed up with fake mustaches on, just pretending to be boys.
So I was on the Sony Pictures lot when they launched the trailer for Ghostbusters, the Paul Feig movie, and they had a lot of fans on the lot that day, many of them wearing their proton packs and stuff. And there was a lot of females there that day, Chris. So they're allowed that day, but they're not allowed there now?
That must have been a glitch. Someone probably got fired for that blunder, let me tell you.
I will say that day I think was a free event. This day, how much do tickets to the Ghostbusters Fan Fest cost, Brad?
The ticketing was pretty outrageous when it was first announced. Like, I think the lowest package for the event was like $500, but because the prices were so high, and I guess some people were complaining, they introduced a lower tier ticket package that was pretty bare bones. But even that was still like $125. And it's only for what is mostly a one-day event that lasts from like noon until 8 on Saturday. But I guess because of the exclusivity of actually being on the Sony lot, like, near the Ghostbusters offices where they're going to have a bunch of cool stuff, is probably why it's so expensive. But, we'll see if it ends up being worth it.
So they're keeping the women out by having the price of $500 because only men would pay that to go to Ghostbusters one-day event.
And the women are underpaid, too, so that's why they can't afford it.
If someone's listening to this podcast for the first time, they probably think we're massive sexists and don't get that we're joking. So just to be clear, we're joking. Okay, let's move on to the news. Let's talk about the news. Let's start off with Ghostbusters. We have learned something about the new Ghostbusters film. Brad, what do we know?
Yeah, today, out of nowhere, there was news from Sigourney Weaver herself. She apparently did an interview with Parade Magazine, of all places, and they were talking about what she has in store for the future, and there was some discussion about the new character she's playing in the Avatar movies, although there weren't any details revealed on it. And then she apparently confirmed that she will be reprising her role as Dana Barrett in the new Ghostbusters sequel. She wouldn't give any details except to say that she's playing that same role again, and there was one quote in the story that said, "It's going to be crazy working with the guys again." And the fact that she said that within the story, it was mentioned that she's working with specifically Bill Murray and Dan Aykroyd. And that in itself is also news because we've yet to hear of any of the legacy cast members officially coming back in a starring capacity for the sequel. We know Dan Aykroyd is producing and co-writing this movie, but we had no idea whether or not the original Ghostbusters would actually be appearing, or if any of them, which ones would. And it's the first time we've heard that Bill Murray is involved in any capacity. A little while back, he had said that he'd be happy to join if he was asked, which is the same reason he ended up doing the cameo in Ghostbusters Answer the Call. But yeah, if this is true, then it seems like they're getting most of the original Ghostbusters. There's no word on whether or not Ernie Hudson will come back as Winston Zeddemore. But one would have...
Brad, what else is he busy doing?
It's a good question. I mean, maybe they'll be doing a revival of Oz at some point. I don't know.
I think he'll be back. I think they're going to all be back. The real question here is, in what capacity are they going to be back? Like, we know the story follows this set of kids, almost like Stranger Things style. Like, are these kids going to be the descendants of any of these Ghostbusters?
There's supposedly some kind of connection to one of the original characters somehow, but it's not indicated as to how they're connected, whether it's familial or whether or not they just happen to live next to one of them. But there will be some kind of connection that the new characters have to someone from the original franchise.
As a Ghostbusters fan, are you more excited knowing they're coming back? Because I feel like their involvement in the last film was actually one of the things I didn't like about that movie.
I mean, yeah, I liked it and I didn't like it in that movie because I appreciate they were making cameos, but it just felt weird that they weren't playing the characters from the original franchise, mostly because the new movie was such a hardcore reboot separate from the other franchise. But I do like the idea of bringing them back. You know, I'm cautiously optimistic about the sequel. We don't really know much about it or how it's going to continue the Ghostbusters story or anything, so having them all back is cool. Hopefully it's more than just, an obligation for them. And it's, something that, Ghostbusters fans and, even general audiences will enjoy.
Well, very cool. We'll look forward to your coverage on the site and probably on the water cooler on Monday. Yesterday afternoon, it was revealed that WarnerMedia's streaming service could cost as much as $17 per month. Chris, what is going on here?
So the WarnerMedia streaming service, which I don't think really has a name yet. I think we're just calling it the Warner streaming service.
By the way, why do we have to call it WarnerMedia? Like, everybody calls them Warner Brothers.
Well, they have other things now. There's more than brothers. There's the Warner sister Dot, so they want to include her in the conversation. Warner Brothers, they're putting together their own streaming service because everyone has to have a streaming service now, and they're apparently going to be one of the priciest streaming services around, maybe even the priciest. Netflix right now is around $12.99 for their standard plan. Hulu is $5.99 with ads, $11.99 without ads. Amazon Prime is $12.99, but WarnerMedia is said to be between $16 and $17 a month, which it's a pretty penny. That's not cheap. The argument, I guess, for it here is that it's going to include HBO and Cinemax in like one big bundle, plus a bunch of Warner Brothers originals. But I don't know. I don't know if people are going to go for this or not. That's not cheap.
But I think a lot of us already are paying somewhat up to like $15 a month for HBO alone. So $2 extra to get all the huge Warner Brothers film library, and then probably originals like the stuff that we're seeing on the DC universe, if that lasts. It seems like a good deal for $2 extra.
I don't know. That $2 adds up, Peter. You could go down to the candy store, get yourself some gummy worms with that $2 a month. It adds up.
Ben, I know you are often skeptical of new streaming services and reluctant to subscribe. Is $17 too much for Warner's Media?
I mean, when you break it down, like all the stuff that you're getting, it's actually not that bad. But with Disney Plus coming out of the gate, that service is supposed to launch in November, I think, and their price point is so much lower than this, and you get arguably more stuff with them. So it just seems like they're trying to change the game and make everybody else look bad. So, the difference between Disney Plus and WarnerMedia's number right now, unless they change it, is very stark. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I guess it's all different strategies, and I'm sure they have bean counters who have run the numbers and figured out that this is the right move for them. But it just when you stack them up right next to each other, the disparity is pretty extreme.
So basically, by the end of the day, when we're subscribing to all the streaming services, we're going to end up paying more than we were paying for cable. I think.
Yeah, and then some of us are still actually paying for cable too, so that sucks as well.
Okay, let's talk about 79ers. This is a comedy described as Goonies for adults. Ben, what do we know?
Yeah, so Kay Cannon, who wrote the Pitch Perfect movies and made her directorial debut last year with a comedy called Blockers, has found her next directorial project, and it is a movie called 79ers, which was originally written by actor-writer Ben Schwartz, who many of you will probably know as the guy who played John Ralphio in Parks and Recreation. The premise for this movie, the film follows a group of estranged friends who are forced back together after 20 years to complete a treasure hunt they attempted as misfit teens but never completed. And Schwartz apparently is no longer involved with the project. It looks like Dylan Meyer has been hired to rewrite the script. But yeah, that's what we know so far. Kay Cannon is a pretty solid director. I mean, she's one for one as far as I'm concerned. Blockers was surprisingly enjoyable, although I have my issues with the adult side of that story. I think the teen stuff is way better there. And this movie is supposed to follow a bunch of people who are, in their 30s or maybe late 30s. So I'm not sure if it's going to have maybe the same charm as her work in Blockers did. But the president of the Lionsgate Motion Picture Group said, Kay is wonderful at capturing characters in situational conflict and is the perfect choice for this re-engineered coming-of-age comedy. I hope when we are finished with this film, it feels like Goonies for adults. So it seems like sort of an aspirational goal for them.
Well, I'm interested in that. I want more adventure stories, either kids or adults. So I'm in, and I really liked Blockers. I might have even liked it more than Booksmart, which I know have gotten groans from some of you. But Brad, you were a fan of Blockers, weren't you?
Yeah, I love Blockers. I think it's fantastic.
So are you excited for this one?
I'm always down for a new comedy that's geared towards adults. Seems to be few and far between R-rated comedies nowadays. The studios don't find them as lucrative. And I think Kay Cannon is definitely, on the rise as a filmmaker. She proved what she can do behind the camera with Blockers, and plus she also wrote Pitch Perfect, which I love, and she used to be a writer and producer on 30 Rock. So she has great comedic sensibilities, and I'm down to see whatever she does.
When I was back in the day when I was writing scripts, someone I knew wrote a script that was basically Goonies for adults, which is about a bunch of adults who learned of this legend of Al Capone's hidden. He had a lot of alcohol hidden, during the Prohibition days, and they basically went out to find that treasure. Never got made. Anyways, okay, let's move on to our last news story for today. This is about a Swiss movie theater chain that has replaced all of its seats with beds. Chris, what do we know?
That's really what we know. Cinema Pathé is what the theater is called in Switzerland. They have, instead of seats, they have beds, and don't worry, they're going to change the sheets after each screening. So if you're going to Switzerland and you want to go to the bed theater, you don't have to get into dirty sheets, which I guess is a plus. And they also serve you food. You can get hot dogs. Who doesn't want to eat a hot dog in bed? I do it all the time. I'm doing it right now, in fact. And yeah, that's the long and short of it.
Okay, I guess the big question here is, do we really want to watch movies while laying down in a bed? I know AMC theaters now with their prime seats, basically let you recline to the point that it is almost straight back. You're basically you're laying in bed, but I guess this has bed sheets.
Yeah, there's pillows. It's the whole deal. You get the sheets, you get the pillows.
See, I like watching movies while I'm in bed. But one part of me is oh, that's kind of cool. But the other part of me remembers, when I was in New York a bunch of years ago, and there was this whole bed bug scare, and everybody was telling me don't go to the movie theaters because there's bed bugs and the seats and all this, all this fear. I think I'd be afraid to be sleeping in these beds that strangers are not sleeping, but watching a movie in a bed with sheets. I mean, Chris, would you do it?
No. I don't mind watching movies in bed, but that's like in the privacy of my own house. I don't want to get in bed in front of people. That's just weird. Like just getting in a bed and people are like standing around me. Like get out of here.
Chris, what is the theater going to do about all the horny teens?
They don't have a plan. They just say that they have faith that things won't get randy and naughty in this theater. So I guess, fingers crossed, horny teens won't come in and get it on during screenings.
I have no faith in that whatsoever. That's what's going to be happening there. This is basically like, those motels that charge by the hour. This is a motel that's going to be charging by the 2-hour time period, I think. Anyways, okay, let's go into our mailbag. Matt from New Jersey writes in. He has a question geared towards Chris. I've never been much of a horror fan. That is until the likes of Hereditary, The Witch, Us. The thing is, I don't see myself enjoying the majority of horror films as much as I have these recent ones. Every time I talk to friends about these movies, they think I'm some kind of horror fan all of a sudden, but I really wouldn't consider myself one. My question is, what is it about these films that you think makes them more enjoyable to non-horror fans? So, Chris, I'll post that question to you.
I don't really know. Maybe it's because they're really good. I love the horror genre. I am a huge horror fan. I think people have a preconceived notion of what horror is, and I think the landscape of horror films over the last few years has sort of hammered that home, that horror films are only movies with jump scares, or they're things like, the Conjuring movies or the Insidious movies. And nothing against those movies. I really like those movies, but horror can be so much more than just, loud banging noises and ghoul faces rushing at the camera. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. I think they just immediately assume if it doesn't have that, it's not a horror film. I also think that's why when movies like, The Witch and It Comes at Night and stuff like that comes out, you have people who are like, well, that's not really a horror film, even though it absolutely is. But they just immediately think, this doesn't have jump scares, it can't actually be horror. And I think the sooner people realize horror has unlimited potential, it can be so much to so many people, they'll start enjoying it more. And that's could be my only guess as to why Matt, not to sell Matt short, maybe he does have an idea of what horror is as a genre, but these films they're a lot more slow burning, they're a lot more, I guess, subtle, although Hereditary isn't really subtle, but they're subtle compared to something like Insidious. So they try and blend their horror with drama, I guess is what these movies are doing. Even like The Witch, which has supernatural stuff, it's like a costume drama. So those films kind of try and be more than just jump scares, and I'm guessing that's what might be drawing Matt to these films in particular.
Do you think it's? I mean, it seems like for many years now, the horror genre, the majority of the horror genre was trying to appeal to a lower common denominator. Like horror was the first genre. I think that there was many sequels, like in the days of Freddy Krueger and Jason and all that stuff. Like there was so many sequels, and it felt like it was just trying to appeal to fan service, appeal to jump scares, all the stuff that you're worried, like you're mentioning here. But there's always been like horror films that have been more elevated is the word I'm gonna use. Like I feel like Exorcist or nowadays the films that he mentioned. But I know horror fans have taken issue with the word of elevated horror movie. So yes. Why is elevated horror movie bad? Because even you describing it seemed like you said something like horror films that are more like are greater, like that feels like elevated, right?
The problem with having a thing that's determines it to be elevated, breaking it off into its own subgenre like that is it's sort of like it just sells the genre short as a whole. And what happens with this is I feel like elevated horror is a problem as a term because people try to use it when they're trying to distance themselves from horror as a whole. They're like, well, I don't really like horror movies. I like elevated horror movies, but they're all horror movies. I mean, look, like, you know,
but elevated horror has horror in the title. I feel like that's not doing that. I feel like people just want a word to grab onto to describe this thing, like this new wave of thing.
I think horror fans, from experience, are very sensitive in the way that they want their genre to be taken seriously, and for a long time, people didn't take horror seriously, and you know, they spent, you know, people tend to think of horror as something for, you know, teens, and since like the 80s on, horror has been sort of geared towards teens, even like R-rated movies. And, you know, people who love the genre and know it can be a lot more than, you know, Scream knockoffs. Not that there's anything wrong with Scream, but they've tried so long to be like, take us seriously. Understand that horror is a real genre. It's not just something frivolous. It can have really important themes. It can have something to say. It can have an actual message. And when you suddenly come in now and be like, well, that's elevated horror, that's not horror, people get a little upset about that.
I mean,
it's like an umbrella, Peter. It's like the people in the horror community they're standing under the same umbrella, and they're trying to draw people in and say, look, it's pretty great under here. You know, there's a lot of really good stuff under here. But then some people are trying to form this new term and pull them outside of that umbrella. And it's just, I mean, you can see how it could be sort of an insulting thing. I mean, there's so much room for so many different types of things under that umbrella too. And I think the real thing that Matt is hitting on in this email is like the difference between jump scares, which Chris talked about, and like dread. I think that is like the through line of movies like Hereditary and The Witch and Us. You know, there's that eerie feeling that's different than just the scare. And yes, that is different than a lot of stuff that appears in the genre. But you know, to completely pull it out just seems like the wrong way to go about doing it.
But I feel like the same thing happens in the comedy genre. Like there's the whole dramedy genre, which I think is kind of elevated comedy. I mean, they don't say elevated comedy, but it's dramedy. Like when you see Little Miss Sunshine, people don't just call that a comedy; it's a dramedy. And I feel like it's there because we want to categorize things in different ways. And I feel like you need to categorize. I don't know. I'm not going to argue for the word elevated because I could see how that could be, I don't know, a bit pretentious. And it could be used to, you know, in a negative way. But I feel like there must be some kind of word. But let's move on from there. I wanted to ask you guys, what are some other good what are some other good elevated horror movies? Like what other word am I supposed to use, guys? Anybody?
I don't know. Just call them horror movies. I mean, I should say that I don't really get that upset when people use the term, but I don't think it's necessary, is what I would say.
But I feel like when you read this email, I'm sure this guy isn't going to love, you know, the jump scare horror movies and the slasher films and Scream and Fred and all that kind of stuff. I think he's looking for what people would term elevated horror films. So I'm wondering, you know, what else would you recommend to him?
As somebody who's not in the, you know, not nearly as big of a genre fan as Chris in this area, I would just say like Get Out is the one that immediately comes to mind. But I'm sure everybody's already seen Get Out at this point because that movie was like a full-fledged phenomenon when it came out. So, yeah,
I feel like maybe It Follows or The Babadook.
Yeah, I would say those fit in there. Even like Us is what you know, you could consider to be part of the, you know, the quote unquote elevated horror genre.
Let the Right One In might be a good one too.
Right.
Yeah.
But I do think there have been films throughout the years. Like this isn't a new thing. Like I said, there's Exorcist. There's like Silence of the Lambs. There's always been horror films that have been more dramatic and more serious in nature, I think. Right? Like, Chris, what is like the most early horror film that you would consider in that category?
What, to be serious? Yeah. I mean, the Universal films of the, you know, the 30s were geared more towards adults. So those are serious, even though they're dealing with, you know, vampires and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, anyway,
we actually have a really good article about why elevated horror isn't really a thing that went up on in June last year. It was written by Jacob Knight, so you should check that out and see why people don't like elevated horror.
Yeah, we will add that to the show notes in case you want to check that out. But I think that brings us to the end of today's Slash Film Daily. If you have a question to write us in the mailbag, send it to peter@slashfilm.com, and please leave your name and general geographic location in case we mention the question on the air. You can find more of all of our work at slashfilm.com. You can find this podcast, Slash Film Daily, published every weekday on iTunes, Google, Overcast, Spotify, all the popular podcast apps. And please rate and review this podcast on iTunes. Tell your friends. Spread the word. And we'll see you on Monday. So, Ben, you don't watch any horror? You do watch horror.
I mean, I do. I'm not nearly. I mean, Chris is like immersed in it. He just came back from a horror film festival, for God's sake. So I don't want to like pretend like I'm any sort of authority on the subject.
What is your favorite horror film of all time?
Oh man, that is a good question. The one that immediately jumps to mind is the first Night of the Living Dead. I've only seen that movie once, and it was only a year ago or something like that I finally caught up with it. But that is, I think, a good example of the type of movie that Chris is talking about, where it's like it's a horror movie for sure, but it also has
allegory.
Yeah, and like deep themes that you can get into, like a lot of stuff to really sink your teeth into with a movie like that.
For sure.